This must be it.
In Binary Domain, the world is still in the process of recovering from a global natural disaster. In a very Al Gore-friendly twist of fate, global warming has caused the Earth's sea levels to rise, leaving most of the world's cities uninhabitable. Apparently being influenced by the Shinra Corporation, the surviving governments decide the only way to rebuild after this disaster is by forming new cities on top of the ruins of the old ones. Now, of course, we were going to need laborers to accomplish this Midgar-esque level of city planning, but with millions dead from the disaster, robots became the world's main workforce. With the boom in the robotics industry came the signing of the New Geneva Convention, banning any research into robots that could pass for humans, or as the game calls them, hollow children. Fast forward to the year 2040, one of these hollow children attacks the Bergen Corporation in Detroit, apparently having no idea he was a robot. This has the world's leaders pissing in their collective pants, which is understandable since these things aren't even supposed to exist. As a countermeasure, every world power has formed their own elite military units who deal specifically in combating robots called Rust Crews. You play as Dan Marshall, a leader of one such Rust Crew who's been sent to Japan to aid in the investigation of the Amada Corporation, the only robotics company with the supposed ability to produce hollow children. Since Japan has once again become a separatist nation, infiltrating the country for a covert investigation is much easier said than done. This was a really interesting setup for me. The idea of robots disguised as humans infiltrating positions of power, and a ragtag group of mercenaries charging headstrong into a foreign land is a compelling one. And I'm glad to see that Sega decided to take the road less traveled with Binary Domain, and give a little more to its players than some okay cover-based shooting. I always appreciate it when developers put just as much effort into a game's story as its gameplay and presentation. I mean, don't get me wrong, this game's no Mass Effect, but while playing through it I was really surprised at how interested I was in the narrative as opposed to the gameplay. Much like Spec Ops: The Line, Sega was playing it safe with Binary Domain's gameplay, and used the cover-based shooter model as a Trojan horse for some damn enjoyable storytelling. And just like Spec Ops, there are some really well-written cutscenes scattered throughout, like this one where a hollow child is found by a group of Yakuza. He has no idea he's a robot, and up until this point he believed he was a regular average Joe just like anyone else. And this character's reaction was very believable, and his performance ended up making the scene very emotional for me.
I don't want to die.
You won't. Only humans can die.
But not every spoken line is a masterpiece. Here's some downright ridiculous dialogue taking place here.
Don't panic, folks. We're here just inspecting the emergency escape route. All okay?
Yes. Sure, everything checks out.
Outstanding.
Which became less of a surprise when I found that Toshihiro Nagoshi and the rest of the team behind Sega's Yakuza series wrote and directed Binary Domain. Those of you familiar with this team's work will be pleased to find out how much this game benefits from their trademark ability to create quirky characters with interesting and unique personalities. I mean, I could go into detail, but instead I'd like to introduce you to Kane, a snarky robot made in France that for some reason speaks English with a French accent and refuses to use any other weapon than a handgun.
They're packing heavy artillery.
That is not heavy, monsieur.
What?
This is heavy.
And if you haven't caught on yet, these guys write some cool characters. However, there is one exception in this multicultural Rust crew. His name is Bo, and I swear every word that came out of his mouth made me cringe. I don't know if it was his annoying ass voice or his borderline retarded dialogue, but as soon as I got to the point where I could swap team members, I couldn't get rid of this mental patient fast enough. In what's going to feel like a reoccurring theme in this review, the story in Binary Domain feels very inconsistent. For every well-written exchange, there's an equally cheesy one, and that's not even counting the token love story. And speaking of which, there is a token love story. But with more and more developers shoehorning needless love stories into their games, I'd be more shocked if Binary Domain didn't have one. Even with the sporadic cheesiness, this game manages to tell a really interesting story that deals with some pretty deep subject matter. Fans of Ghost in the Shell, RoboCop, or Snatcher will undoubtedly get a kick out of Binary Domain's story, and as long as you go into it expecting a little bit of that trademark campiness the Yakuza team is known for, you'll find a surprisingly rich sci-fi narrative with some really creative characters that may or may not be amalgamations of every racial stereotype in existence. This was a really tough part to write, and that's because I typically find that when I really like one aspect of a game, I tend to be a little too forgiving with the parts of the experience that may have fallen short. And as far as gameplay is concerned, Binary Domain has most certainly fallen short. So I went back and took an objective look at my time with this game and tried to put myself in the shoes of a gamer who might value gameplay over story, and in doing this I found the game's many flaws much harder to stomach. Don't get me wrong, gameplay here isn't broken or anything. I mean, it's a cover-based shooter, there isn't too much to screw up. But my problem with the gameplay is the same as my problem with the story. Binary Domain is too inconsistent, and its high points only make its problems seem worse. But before we get into that, let's start off with the aspects of Binary Domain's gameplay that I did like. Unlike other games in the genre, all of your enemies are robots, and this paved the way for a very cool limb damage mechanic that rewards an accurate player for targeting specific parts of an enemy's body. For example, destroying an enemy's arm will make them drop their weapon, and hitting their legs will force them to crawl using only melee attacks. Their heads are also hot spots, and blowing one off will make the enemy target anyone near them, friend or foe. I gotta say, I had a lot of fun aiming for specific points on enemies, and I noticed myself blind firing and shooting from the hip much less than I normally would in a shooter. Decapitating 3 or 4 enemies in a large group and watching them take down their own teammates feels pretty damn satisfying. Throughout the game you'll meet up with other Rust crews from different countries, and you'll eventually get the option to change out who you want on your team. This is a very welcome change for an RPG fan like myself. Early on I found 2 or 3 characters that I liked, and despite the first 20 minutes of the game I wasn't really forced to play with a character that I hated. Also, since there are many opportunities to change squad members, I never had to worry about trying out someone new and being stuck with them. After choosing your team, you can equip them with nanomachines that will buff specific attributes like defense, health, reload speed, etc. These nanomachines are character specific and can be found all over the place, or you can purchase them at stores. These stores also let you buy ammo and upgrade your squad members' weapons. On top of all this customization, you can also build a rapport with your teammates by having conversations or giving them orders using the voice interface. Don't worry, I'll go deeper into this mechanic later. The ability to pick your squad, customize their stats, upgrade their equipment as you see fit, and earn their admiration really made me feel like I had a very personalized and likable crew of soldiers. But as cool as these elements are, they can't cover up Binary Domain's numerous shortcomings. And trust me, they are numerous. My first gripe comes in the form of the game's button assignments, specifically the action button. In their infinite wisdom, Sega decided to assign the dash, dodge roll, and confirm functions, 3 completely different actions to the same button. Now I know this doesn't seem like a huge deal, especially from me, a vocal proponent for tank controls, but the objects you can interact with have very small hotspots, so you have to be right up on them before the option to hit the action button is even available. This means that if you're dashing and you want to go behind cover or climb a ladder, you're almost guaranteed to hit the action button too soon, which will send you into a roll. This became more and more frustrating as the game continued and the difficulty increased. I feel like this would have been a non-issue if these functions would have been spread across 2 separate buttons. And while we're on the subject, why the hell was the reload key pulling double duty for a special attack? Dan's gun could be charged to produce a powerful energy attack, but since this requires you to hold down the reload key, I ended up reloading my weapon while running out of cover to pull off a charged shot 9 times out of 10. Needless to say, this was annoying as hell, and all of this is because they needed a button to facilitate the game's revolutionary voice controls. Now don't get me wrong, I like the idea of shouting tactical orders to my squad as much as the next guy. In theory, this could free up buttons to be used in the game and give you a more immersive experience. Of course, the keyword being, in theory. In practice, Binary Domain's voice control is just a poorly implemented gimmick, and a buggy one at that. I spent a good hour or 2 using my gaming headset to get a feel for this mechanic, and I would say 70% of the time the game either didn't recognize my commands, or my characters would shout that they didn't understand me, and I wasn't even saying anything.
You cold? What's up? Will you repeat that?
And this really sucks because when I started the game, I was excited to use it. I even went through the voice control options and calibrated each recognized word to perfection. But after about an hour of frustration, I started to notice that my squad did a fine job on their own. There was never really a need to give them any orders. Just like most games with squad controls that I've ever played, my AI-controlled teammates did a fine job of taking care of themselves. I think Sega figured this out too, and decided to punish players further by implementing moments that outright required feedback. For example, during a boss fight or a particularly hard skirmish, my teammate would decide to use a really powerful sub-item like an EMP grenade, which was really cool. Or at least it would have been if they weren't hounding me for permission to use it every 10 seconds.
Dan, I'll confuse the enemy with a chaff grenade. Sound good? Okay, got it.
Now since I decided to forego voice controls, I was left using the tab key to bring up a list of responses and hitting shift to confirm my selection. Of course, all of this is performed in the middle of a heated firefight. This got really frustrating really quick, and in the end I decided to not even answer my teammates when they brought up these ideas. I just ignored them outright. But don't worry if you haven't gotten your fill yet, the voice controls haven't been isolated to the game's combat scenarios. There are also times when you're forced into useless and boring conversations that seem only to exist to bring any fun you are having to a crashing halt.
Well, that's rather lame. Aren't you used to tight spots like this? That's what I want to hear.
During these mandatory exchanges, you're supposed to respond to your squad member, and you'll gain favor with them based on whether or not they liked what you had to say. The idea behind this being your squad won't follow your orders if they don't like you. But since I stopped giving them orders about 5 hours ago, I could care less whether or not my squad hated my guts or revered me as the second coming. And just in case you still want to participate in this bullshit, here's a little secret. Just keep saying yes. I'm not kidding. No matter what the other person has to say, 99.9% of the time, saying yes will result in a good response. To be completely honest, there were a lot of aspects of Binary Domain's gameplay that were really fun, and I may have been able to overlook most of its problems if it weren't for the shitty voice controls. Their failings bring the experience down way too far, and choosing not to use them is just as frustrating. It's really rare to find a game as disappointing as Binary Domain, but not because it's a shitty game as a whole. There are some really great points to its gameplay, but it's just a shame that the pros are so heavily outweighed by the cons.
Which one of you is Charlie? So you must be Dan, the smart one. Welcome to Shibuya. I'm Yuki.
On the whole, I can honestly say that Binary Domain has a very pleasing level of graphical prowess on display. Now I know that this goes against the common argument that cover-based shooters are all taking place in samey-looking hallways permeated by chest-high cover, but lucky Binary Domain's developers didn't get this memo, because the game has a very polished look to it. As a matter of fact, I found that the game's graphics help keep me from getting bored with its cookie-cutter gameplay, especially when it comes to the diversity in locations. Throughout the game, I found almost every area was varied and visually appealing. The look of Binary Domain's environments also succeed in giving you a visual reference for how far you've made it into Japan. When the game starts, Dan and Bo are in what amounts to a giant trash heap outside of the wall that Japan's built around itself. From here, you gradually progress into the lower city and its ruins, stopping at underground strongholds and crime-ridden slums. This gave me a real sense of perspective when I finally made it to Japan's glistening upper level with its shimmering buildings and attractive design. Throughout the entire game, I really felt like I was progressing, even though I was technically playing the same way with the same characters. This is because every location visually differed from where I had been. I really got the feeling that my surroundings were getting nicer as the game's difficulty climbed. This gave me an honest-to-God feeling of progress, plus it had the added bonus of making you feel sorry for the squalor that the poor had to live in when you saw how ritzy life was for those in the upper levels of Japan. The game's main characters were decent looking, but this had nothing to do with how they looked graphically. I just feel like they were designed poorly. They weren't bad looking, but they just weren't interesting enough, and none of them really stood out visually for me. But having said that, I have to applaud Sega for making sure everyone's faces were well animated. I can't count how many games I've played where an emotional scene has been ruined by robotic or uninspired animations. It seems like a lot of attention has been paid to damage effects too. Blowing off enemy limbs shatters them into tiny pieces, and all these pieces interact realistically with the environment. I was actually surprised by how many metallic particles could be on screen without any noticeable drops in performance. I always like to see little touches like this made to increase the chaotic feeling of a gunfight. And this also serves a practical purpose, as hitting any enemy in the same spot long enough will destroy the metallic armor covering that area. This exposes their weak points, and it was nice to see that each enemy and boss had several spots that could be visually damaged and destroyed. Like I said in my Max Payne 3 review, I think it's important to give your player a clear sense they're doing damage to the enemy. And this game it's destroyable character models, in other games it may be bullet holes or even something as simple as a life bar. But no matter how it's retooled to fit the gameplay, the important thing is that the player feels like their attacks are having an effect on the game's world. Speaking of enemies, Binary Domain has some really interesting enemy designs. Well, maybe not all of them. A large percentage of the game is spent fighting what looks like palette swaps of those things from iRobot. But larger enemies, and especially bosses, look great and are designed to complement the game's overall art style. In the end, Binary Domain's graphics are pretty good overall. There isn't really too much to write home about here, but there aren't too many complaints either, aside from a little bland character design here or there. I enjoyed the fact that the game's graphics just set the stage for the gameplay and enforced its atmosphere. It's rare to see a AAA title work so hard to keep the feel of the game elevated above its look. And with the growing popularity of setting graphical fidelity as a game's highest priority, or as I call it the crisis school of game design, Binary Domain was able to accomplish a lot with what I can assume was a pretty small budget. So let's start off with the positives. Here's what I liked about Binary Domain. The ability to pick your own team from a roster of interesting characters and customize that team's weapons and stats is a very welcome change in the cover-based shooter market. Blowing off robot extremities felt viscerally rewarding and added a little depth to the combat as well. This game has one hell of a narrative, and despite the game's slow pace of delivering it, I would say it's easily the best part of Binary Domain. But while the story may be great, there is a lot wrong with this game, so let's dive into what I didn't like. The cover-based shooting of Binary Domain is mild at best, and even the fun aspects of the gameplay were brought down by some annoying ones. One such annoyance was the piss-poor button assignments. Having 3 separate actions mapped to the same key is unacceptable, not to mention the terrible job Sega did porting these controls to the PC version. The heads-up display can become so crowded with information that it's hard to see the action. At one point you may have your health and ammo meters, a prolonged button prompt, each team member's health and voice control readouts, and your inventory on screen at once. As bad as these elements are, they are dwarfed when compared to Binary Domain's terrible voice control system. This was a poorly implemented gimmick that should have stayed in the untested concept phase, and turning this feature off makes the experience even more frustrating. Considering Binary Domain's many shortcomings, this will go down as the first game I have ever reviewed that I can't recommend. There's just too many things done wrong and far too few done right, which I guess is to be expected of a Japanese development team trying to emulate a Western style of gameplay with no previous experience with it. Stick to the Yakuza series, guys. But for those who are willing to sift through the crap, there's a really interesting sci-fi story to be found here. And unfortunately, not much else. Well, that's about all the time I'm willing to dedicate to complaining about video games, but make sure to leave a comment down below. Did you like the review? Did you hate it? How do you feel about US trade embargoes? I love hearing back from you guys, so give me some interesting reading material. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. And I'll see you guys next time, and until then, I'm Jared.
Easy for you to say. You're not the one about to shit your pants.
And this has been Avalanche Reviews. Thanks for watching, guys. I know this one took a little longer to come out than usual, but I'm back on schedule and the next review should be out shortly. If you guys ever want to drop me a line, you can find me on Facebook and Twitter. And if you're new to the show, make sure to subscribe and check out some of my other videos here.